we'll wait one more minute and we'll kick off, guys. There's a few more people coming in there. So it's 11 minutes past 2. I think we'll start to kick off, and I'm sure more people will continue to join us. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today, this morning, taking time out of their day to hear how to grow your business through grant funding. I'm Stephen Mullen, country manager here at Swoop, and I'll be grilling Kate Whitehead, who's a fantastic partner of Swoop and all things knowledgeable about grants, business grants in Australia. Thanks very much for joining us, Kate.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
And special welcome to everybody who was maybe celebrating Melbourne Cup yesterday and just getting back into the swing of things after a good, enjoyable day. I suppose we'll kick off with just go through some rules or webinar rules or before we get into our discussion about all things grants. So today's webinar will last 30 minutes. At the end of the webinar, we will spend quite a bit of time, hopefully, taking questions from you guys. If you have a question about your current business, or you're thinking about applying for a current grant, or you run through any scenarios, I would really recommend writing some questions into the chat box so Kate can impart her wisdom on those things. We will log the questions. If we don't catch any during the webinar, we'll follow up at the end as well. Finally, we'll be recording the webinar and we'll send it out to you guys and anybody who's registered. And just for a quick agenda, we'll have some open remarks myself, and then we'll let Kate give herself a proper introduction, and then we'll just go straight into the topics, which why we're all here is to help your business achieve grants success. And as I say, finally finishing with a Q&A. So before we jump straight in, why are we here today? We're here today because we're organized by Swoop Funding. What are we? We are a fintech platform that allows businesses like yourself to input some, I suppose, information about their business. So you plug in your cloud accounting practice software, and we'll recommend the best finance option for you. There's thousands of options across loans, across equity investment opportunities, and of course grants. By quickly analyzing your information, we can recommend a particular type of grant based on your sector, based on where you are geographically. There's lots of state grants and things like that, and just at what stage you are as a business, such as a startup or maybe a more established business. How do we do that? As I say, this is, I suppose, a nice, simple illustration of our system. We take your data, we make it as easy as possible for you, and we make those recommendations. Any recommendations that you do see when you sign up to the platform are based upon the information you provided. So we spend a lot of time analyzing grants, analyzing finance products such as loans, and making sure that we can match you based on your turnover, based on your trading age, based on, as I say, plugging in your bank account. So try and make it as easy as possible. And we do get a lot, of course, people using us to find, okay, what kind of grants can I get out of the hundreds and hundreds of there? And then we work with people like Kate to, I suppose, help you write the grants, help you analyze your business, and do a bit of a deeper dive. And so that's why we work with businesses of all types. In Australia, we've had some really good successes, as you can see, whether it's grants, whether it's loans, whether it's a recent equity investment that we were able to land for one of our clients. So we can work one-to-one with you. We can use our technology to streamline it and help you with the application process. Where can you find us? So I think you can find us, if you haven't signed up already to Swoop, I would really recommend that you go using the hyperlink, and Aisha might put the hyperlink into the chat box if anyone does want to see what grants are applicable to them using our matching system, using your information. Please sign up and take a look for yourself in a matter of minutes. So a Swoop overview, I suppose. Maybe we'll kick in now to our discussion. But before I do, I'll pass over to Kate. Kate, can you give us a bit of an introduction about yourself and what you're doing at Avant Group?
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Welcome, everybody. So thank you for that very kind introduction. So Avant Group is a specialist government grants professional services firm. So we have a sort of very sector-based team of consultants that help organisations to identify and then apply for and also maintain ongoing compliance and management of government grants and funding. So we're very specialised in that area. We have technical expertise. So in our research and development side of the firm, we've got a team of engineers with aerospace engineering background, chemical engineering background, mechanical engineering, science, agri-science, etc. So they help with very sort of complex technical documentation and collation for the R&D tax incentive program as one example. We've also got a very large competitive grants writing team. They're the ones that write the sizzle pitch documents and the compelling pitches for those elusive competitive grants. And then we've also got a very large export grants practice as well. So we'll touch on a couple of those programs today. But yeah, look, thank you very much for having me today.
Thanks, Kate. Well, let's get straight into the nitty-gritty of it. I suppose there's been a lot of ups and downs for businesses and business grants and for everything, for all types of sectors in Australia over the last year. And it has seen a lot of changes in the way grants are handed out and the number of them that are handed out. But could you maybe just start by giving us a general overview of what you see in the grant landscape at the minute, and maybe highlight what particular grants are currently available for businesses?
Yep. Okay. So the grants you mentioned before, and it was very, very accurate in that there are a lot of them out there. So it can be a bit of a minefield when you start the investigation process to look at what's available for your own organisations and your own growth strategies. Generally, there are three different types of grant funding from the government. So one area is what we call entitlement-based programs. So they are programs that if you are appropriately structured or you're investing in project activities of a eligible kind and you maintain very good compliance and documentation, then you're entitled to that grant funding. So that's obviously the best space to start off with, is to understand, what you might be missing out on that you're actually entitled to. Those programs have very strong audit and compliance function attached to them for obvious reasons. So the government's handing out the money, they want to make sure that they're handing it to the appropriate organisations and they're doing the right thing with that regard. The next area of funding is in the competitive grant space. So that's where there's a limited funding pool. There'll be a window of funding that's open for a specific period of time. We put an application in and your application competes with everybody else's in that pool of funding, and then the government determines who they'll be giving the funding to in that particular round. When we're looking at competitive grants, it's important to understand likelihood of funding. So we call it a P-win, a probability of win. So it's about assessing the project or the investment that you're seeking funding for, and then looking at how closely that aligns to the merit criterion that the government publish in each particular round. And then that gives us a good feel for the likelihood of funding. And then there's also an organisational profile requirement as well. So, some grants require companies to have been running for a minimum of 3 years, for example, before applying for certain grants. So it's reviewing and assessing, and then putting in a compelling argument or pitch to the government for those sorts of funds. And then the third area of funding is in the competitive lending space, actually. So we do see some grants that have that are sort of a quasi loan. Or even a straight out loan where you've got to pitch for the funding from the government, but it's usually at zero interest or very low interest. So again, it's another space that could be worth investigating for organisations. So they're the three key areas. You mentioned about the current landscape. So what we've seen, obviously, the last 2 years has been quite an unusual space for grant funding in general. There's been a lot of funding that's been invested into business sustainment and sort of saving organisations because of very stressful operating conditions, particularly in certain sectors. So we've seen funding being diverted often in sort of smaller batches of funding to organisations that have been impacted by lockdown. So there's been sort of smaller payments of $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 payments out to organisations if they fall within appropriate ANZIC categories. We're also seeing a lot of funding also being diverted into the arts, which, I think hospitality has been impacted, tourism's been impacted, and so has our arts sector. So there's been some very big funds open there. For example, there's one open at the moment called the Rise Fund. There's one batch left of that, $20 million up for grabs in this cycle, and that's a very large-scale competitive grant for running of festivals and events. So, we're seeing that, there's been quite a diversion there. And then also manufacturing's seen a lot of funding. So there's been a real shift towards moving that sort of a lot of funding back to sovereign capability and manufacturing supply chains. So there's been quite a lot of investment in that area as well.
And maybe I would recommend everybody, there's such a, I suppose, depth of grants out there in so many different sectors, that if you want to put into the chat just now what sector you're involved in, that might help us steer the conversation, and maybe we could talk about some specific grants, whether it is hospital that you mentioned there, or events. And I want to see as many grants go out to events companies as possible, so we get as many events back up and running, and music festivals and things like that in the coming year. But I'll just go straight. We actually had a question come in here already from Dylan. And I think it could be a very interesting one. Can you provide, in your, I suppose, current role, Kate, can you provide advisory on the Accelerating Commercialisation Grant?
Yep, absolutely. So the Accelerating Commercialisation Grant, that's one of the limbs under the Entrepreneurs Program. So it's a federal government grant. It used to be capped at $1 million, but now it's only capped at 500,000. So they've decreased the value of the grant, but it pays on a 50-50 basis. It is the only grant of its style that is open all the time and is very hotly contested. So it typically only funds 2.5% of applicants. So that gives you an idea of the competition in this particular grant. And I think it's because it is open all the time and it's open to everybody. It's an unusual one where it's looking at investment or facilitation into commercialisation, and it is the only grant that will actually fund the period of what they call the critical valley of death in a business cycle. So generally you invest heavily in your research and development activities, and then the AC steps in to actually get you back up and out into that commercialisation cycle. So being able to match it with funding is obviously important, but the first thing we do whenever we look at an AC is understand your IP protection strategy, what the opportunities for the business into global markets, and whether there actually is some initial demand, some seeded demand coming through from those international markets, because you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've got a clear path to market. And if you've got a very strong technology or a good IP protection strategy underpinning the business, then that's certainly one that's worth investigating. Yeah.
Sounds like a really interesting one. And maybe we'll you can catch up with Dale after and have a conversation to go into a bit further. Just next question, Kate. I suppose everyone loves grants. Everyone loves thinking that they can get a grant from their business, but what should businesses be aware of before they start applying or exploring grant funding?
Yep. Okay, so the first thing is obviously the easiest one is eligibility. So often we'll see organisations that unfortunately they haven't been structured appropriately, and doesn't mean it's game over, just means that we might have to do a restructuring process into different types of corporate entities before being able to apply. So the first thing to do is have a look at the eligibility criteria, and they always publish it, who can apply for this grant. And if you do not tick all of those boxes, stop, because it's a go, no go for the government. So that's one of the key things. The next thing is, I always say square peg, square hole. So we do see a lot of organisations where they've got something that sort of fits into a grant, and they try and sort of mash it into a grant structure. It just doesn't work. So you've got to have a really clearly aligned business goal or investment that matches beautifully with the government fund. And a recent example of that was we've seen, especially in the Manufacturing Modernisation Fund, they've articulated 6 priority sectors that they're going to fund. And I've had people from outside of those sectors contacting me saying, oh, well, we sort of go into that sector. And I say, look, it's a competitive grant. You're being weighted against each other, by not fitting into the grant guidelines beautifully. Again, the chances of getting funding are sort of very slim to none. So that's sort of something to be aware of. And then probably the third key thing is I know it sounds simple, but it goes back to what you were told when you're doing your exams in school. Read the question, answer the question. They ask you the questions. It's around being able to articulate and clearly define, this is how we align with this grant, and this is what's the benefit the government's going to get. Give them the benefits, so we do see that a lot where people have self-applied and they've done a great job and they've written a great narrative, but it's being weighted and scored against your ability to actually match those merit criteria. And I read it and I go, it's a great project. It should have gotten funding, but it didn't, because it didn't actually clearly articulate the pitch. So that's probably the other third thing to be aware of is making sure that you align, and then you align your answers to that as well. Yeah.
And thanks very much for everyone. There's a lot of questions coming in, so we'll definitely get into them and spend plenty of time at the end. We'll just run through some more questions to give a broad overview. And one of them one of them for you, Kate, is you talked about eligibility, you talked about what's right, what's wrong there. But in terms of Avant Group, how do you help businesses navigate the grants process in particular?
Yep. Okay. So what we do is we just initially have a conversation with companies to understand, what are you doing? What's your business sector? How are you structured? What are your plans? What are your investment plans, etc. One general rule of thumb with grants is the government doesn't fund what they call BAU, business as usual. So if it's about, we need and the only exception to that was actually all these COVID grants, because they were funding business as usual, but that's definitely shifting, and we're now seeing that movement back to growth rather than sustainment. So it's about understanding what the organisation profile is and where you're looking at investing, or what you're looking to get funded. We then help to very easily identify what may or may not be available to you. And then from there, we manage the application process. We manage the negotiation with government upon successful award as well. So it's around the contract terms, etc. And then the ongoing compliance and audit function of the grant. So once you've received a grant, especially in the competitive grant space, it's not a case of, okay, you've got $1 million, here it is, we'll see you in 2 years' time. You actually have to then have ongoing reporting and compliance mechanisms in place. So we help with that ongoing piece as you sort of unlock your funding as your project ticks along. So we sort of do that from the start to the end. And then that tends to work well because we stay abreast and very close to the company's operations and activities. So then often what happens is more grants open up throughout the period. We reach out, we've got another one for you, here it is, and then run that process as well. So that's just that's generally how we help with businesses. Yeah.
In terms of the processes, I'm sure that is vary, but typically, how long will it take from a process from application to receipt of the funds, for example?
Unfortunately, a long time. I wish I had a better answer than that. It's one of the biggest frustrations for me, to be honest. And when you're talking about a competitive grant, you cannot spend the money until you've been approved. So one of the merit criterion is need for funding. So if you're going out and spending the money anyway, well, then clearly you don't need the money. So in the competitive grants landscape, it takes a long time. We're seeing some better than others. So in the defence space, that's probably one of the worst case examples I can give you. We had an application that went in December and they were awarded 2 weeks ago. So that's one of the worst. In the RISE grants, in the events grants that I mentioned before, we're seeing really quick turnaround. And I think that's because there's a lot of pressure on the department to do that. So we're sort of seeing turnarounds out of the Department of the Arts coming in at sort of 8 weeks max. So
Okay.
that's one of the best scenarios. I think anything that's coming from Oz industry at the moment, because there's been so many ministerial changes. So we've had Karen Andrews, then we've had Christian Porter, and now we've got what's his name? I've got a mental blank. Andrew Wills. But anyway, so they've had so many shifts on the department that's delaying all of the ministerial decision-making processes. So that's why we're getting that those big 10-month windows. So, but they do take a long time, unfortunately.
Anything government related, I find takes some
Pretty
time.
much. Yeah, in the export grants, it's a first in, first serve basis. So the sooner you get it in, the sooner you're processed. So that's a bit of a conveyor system. So that's a caveat to that. In R&D tax incentive, they're very quick. So it's sort of 10 to 30 days to get your innovation number, unless you're audited, in which case it can take up to 90. So yeah, but generally 30 days is the best case scenario.
And I might, before we go into questions, just ask you to elaborate a bit more on those two grants, because those two grants are definitely the most popular grants that come to Swoop. People looking to the Export Market Development Grant and the R&D grant, and of course they cover a lot of different sectors. So just for the benefit of everyone, I think for the last 2 minutes before we jump into all the questions, do you want us to give us an overview of those in a bit more detail?
Absolutely. So R&D tax incentive, so it's an entitlement-based program for corporate entities that undertake investment into research and development activities. So a clear delineation between that is a lot of people think NPD is R&D, so new product development is research and development. Not necessarily. So R&D must be investing into novel technologies that carry high levels of technical and financial risk for the firm. And if you're investing in that, then you're eligible for up to a 43.5% cash refund on R&D activities. So let's say, for example, you're a software company. I'm giving this as just an example because we might have some fintechs, for example. If you're a software company and you're doing straight coding, even if it's custom coding, if it's straight coding, and you know that you can achieve the outcome, or you're doing some API integrations and plugins integrations, and you're delivering something, that generally wouldn't be an R&D project. The caveat to that is there may be elements where we might find some R&D, and that's in some custom algorithm development, for example, in which case we would capture the costs attached to that element of the R&D. So in that example, we'd be able to claim costs such as a percentage of our rent, a percentage of the utilisation of the software and equipment and computer equipment and peripherals to do the R&D, the wage costs associated with that, et cetera, and then at the end of each year, you put in a report to the government, and then you run the claim through your normal tax refund. And as I said, you can get up to 43.5% back. So if you spend $100,000 and you're in a non-tax payable position, it's a $43,500 cash refund from the government. So it's a very good program for startup organisations, and one that's always worth investigating. On the other side of the fence, if you're considered to be what they call export ready, so again, you can be in those early stages of startup, but you've got to actually have a product that you're ready to sell or a service into overseas markets, then you're entitled to, depending on the nature of the products, there's a few little caveats there, but in the most part, you're entitled to up to $740,000 of funding over 8 grants to help you promote your product or service into overseas markets. So again, a really good program that's always worth investigating eligibility and making sure that you structure appropriately from the get-go to be able to unlock that funding as you take your product into overseas markets.
Okay, excellent. And I'll just maybe jump in. There's been quite a few questions. First one is one we also receive a lot of information or requests for, and it's from Peter Maver. He's looking for a grant for or grant information for 100% Indigenous owned business. Are you able to provide any guidance on that?
Yeah, so there are some grants that do. Well, okay, firstly, all competitive grants, actually as part of the application process, they do ask if you're an Indigenous owned entity. So there is a certain weighting or a merit criterion that they do put onto that, which is great. And then the next stage around that is there are some specific funds that open and close throughout the year, but a lot of them, it wouldn't be so much based on the activity around EV. They'd be more so looking around engagement of Indigenous peoples or employment outcomes in regional or remote areas, for example. Similarly, what we're seeing now, and I think Glasgow is going to be a bit of a driver of this, is a real push and drive around new innovative technologies in clean tech. So if you're going down the EV side of the world, then there will be some opportunities opening up. But there's nothing as at today, right now, that I'd say that's the perfect fit for you. But it's within the next quarter, I definitely would be seeing some funds opening with sort of something with a remit, whether it's on the Indigenous side or if it's actually on the EV side.
And like all the questions, we'll put up the contact details for myself and Kate at the end of this presentation, and we can take a further discussion then. There's another question, which is interesting, and I might answer part of it myself. It's from Ellie Davidson, and she's looking to know where the eligibility criteria for grants, such as many of the ones that you've mentioned, are housed. And I might jump in this quickly, but Ellie, we did a huge amount of work here at Swoop to actually take the eligibility criteria for dozens of loans and upload it onto our, suppose, back-end system, meaning that you don't have to check the eligibility criteria. You go to swoopfunding.com, you sign up, you put in your business information, and you'll then be able to see what grants you're eligible for, and then start the application process through Swoop. But maybe Kate, I might put it to you, is there where else apart from Swoop would you find eligibility criteria, whether it's government websites, that type of thing?
Yeah, honestly, what you've answered there is the easiest way to do it, because otherwise you're going through the minefield of looking at each individual grant guideline and reading each individual eligibility criteria. So the advice when I was saying before around applying, it's before diving into an application process, if you've identified a grant where you're saying, oh, that sounds great for us, is those guidelines will want to be on each individual government website pertaining to that. And then when you're talking in R&D and EMDG land, that's extremely complex legislation. So there's little minefields and thorns in the legislation all throughout, like simple things like if you're a visa agent, you're ineligible, which if you're reading the upfront guidelines, you wouldn't actually pick up on that. So that's talking to an advisor is always recommended in that example as well.
Yeah, definitely recommend talking to an advisor. Just makes life easier for all types of finance, whether grants, loans, or equity. And just a few more questions here. Sarah, she has a product that she's getting manufactured in Australia instead of China. Would that fall into the manufacturing grants or that style of grants? So even though that it isn't in Australia.
Yep. So the manufacturing grants cover percentages towards CapEx, so capital infrastructure. So would you be eligible to apply? Yes, even though you're not a manufacturer, but it's whether or not you'd need to apply because you may not need the kit. So if you were saying, right, I'm outsourcing the manufacturing, I now want to develop my own in-house manufacturing capability and I want to invest into capital infrastructure to do that, then you could apply for that funding. Alternatively, you could look at trying to do a partner application with your manufacturing partner, and then they would be the recipient of the grant funding because they're the ones installing the capital equipment. Hopefully that hasn't confused that. So yeah.
Okay. And Sarah is looking to apply for the EMDG grant, the Export Market Development Grant. The application date is the 30th of November, I think, as you mentioned, but she's just not quite trading yet. She's launching in January. What would be your advice for her? Should you apply now maybe and hope that it would be okay with January, or will she have to wait for the next cycle?
It would depend. So that's a good non-answer, isn't it? So so you could technically apply for it now because the grant window that we're applying for is for, money spent in the FY22 period. So it's whether or not you're going to be incurring any eligible export promotional expenditure in the first 6 months of the calendar year. Being so early, and depending on your investment levels, it may actually suit you better to hold off. And the reason I say that is you only get 8 of these grants, so they're quite precious. So if you think you're launching and then you're going to be able to sell locally, then sell overseas and actually incur enough eligible expenditure to warrant using one of your 8 precious grants, then I would say go now. If that's not the case, hold off and then apply in July 2022 when the next window opens for the FY23 expenditure.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. And I just realized that they were nearly at half now. I think we've got across a lot of the questions. Maybe we haven't got across a few, but we'll pass them on to Kate after this.
Yep.
I'm conscious of the time. What I would maybe, actually, if you could pull up the slides now, we can just do a couple of concluding marks. I suppose from my end, thanks very much for joining from Swoop. As I say, you can come on swoopfunding.com.au. It's a free service to use. Sign up. And be able to see what grants you're applicable to instead of trawling through the many government guidelines. You can find my information, email information on the screen as well if you want to reach out personally to me. And I'll pass over to Kate to give some concluding remarks ourselves and contact details.
Yep. So thank you everybody for coming today. And I'm sorry, half an hour's gone very quickly. I think I talked too much, but appreciate everyone joining us. Yeah, my contact details there. Please don't worry about reaching out. More than happy to have a chat to anyone that's got any questions, and more than happy to assist. I saw a couple of people asking around fee structures. So generally we work on a commission basis for a lot of the programs. In the competitive grants, we charge a nominal writing fee and a success commission. So we very much gear towards getting them over the line for you. But yeah, please feel free to reach out to myself and Stephen if you've got any questions. And thank you for your time today.
And that's 11:30. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and thanks for the many questions. It's been fantastic, and we'll be doing a number of these sessions throughout the year, so hopefully you can join us again in the future.
Sounds great. Thank you.